Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest European Parliamentary Research Service Book Talk. I'm Anthony Teasdale from the EPRS, and it's my great pleasure to introduce today Luuk van Middelaar, who has written this book, Pandemonium, Saving Europe, and we're going to be discussing that with two distinguished academics, Professor Vernon Bogdanor of Oxford and now King's College London, and Katarzyna Krzyzanowska from the Central European University and the European University Institute. And this book by Luuk van Middelaar looks at how the European Union has responded to the coronavirus crisis and what that reaction says about the changing nature of the European political system. Building on his reputation as one of the leading philosophers and historians of contemporary Europe, which was established most notably by his book, The Passage to Europe, How a Continent Became a Union in 2013, and subsequently by Alarums and Excursions, Improvising Politics on the European Stage in 2019, which looked at the various crises of the last decade. The author explains in his new book how events and decisions unfolded during the coronavirus crisis and how solutions were improvised in a situation of deep uncertainty. And he argues that although the European Union has coordinated a formidable response to date, which suggests, as he's put it, its enduring strength and how it has learnt to deal with real-world events on a journey from being a regulatory body to a geopolitical actor. He also argues that Europe's next challenge will most likely come from its uneasy position between a strategically assertive China and a more self-centered United States. Facing this will require a greater political will than has so far been mustered in the current crisis and a greater sense of Europe's own historical and cultural identity. So, Professor von Middelaar is going to set out the main arguments in his book and dialogue with our two discussants, Katarzyna and Vernon, and answer questions from the digital floor. So over to you, Luuk.
Thank you, Anthony, for that kind introduction and also for the invitation to present a few ideas, a new book here in the pleasant company of Katarzyna and Vernon as well. Very much looking forward to our exchange later on. So I thought, by way of presenting the book, I suggest to break it down in three parts, in three things which the book Pandemonium tries to do. And the first one is, in a way, relatively modest in ambition, is just to offer a chronicle of the EU response to that crisis. In a way, obviously, that crisis is not over. We're now at the stage of Omicron. We're not yet at the end of the Greek alphabet in terms of new virus variants. And so there may be more ahead, but I thought early on that it would be worthwhile to really take a look at how the EU or how Europe collectively had responded to this unprecedented event, which struck obviously every single nation, single state on earth with surprise, but which posed particular challenge for the EU as such. Now, this chronicle in a way makes up the heart of the book. It's a story focusing really on the very dramatic and intense months, especially between the COVID outbreak, February 2020, on the European continent, and the first robust response in July 2020. Part of the story is carried forward until last spring, when I had to hand in the manuscript. But really the center of gravity is on what happened in these first 4, 5, 6 months. And I was struck early on by the contrast between a very bleak and bitter moment, February 2020. There were hellish scenes and coming from Italy about people dying in the corridors of hospitals, a call for help which went unanswered at the time from Italy, soon from Spain. There was, let's say, inaction from the side of EU institutions. We'll look at that further. Selfishness from other national governments, which were hoarding their own protective medical gear and so on. So it was all very bitter, not only on the front of public health, but then soon enough, other dimensions very dear to the European Union as such came also under pressure. Borders were closed, which is a very traumatic experience for some, and the threat of economic, well, depression at least, if not disaster, was looming. And in that mood of February, March, unsurprisingly, first voices could also be heard predicting the imminent end of the European Union as such, and warning for, well, either on economic grounds for a breakdown or on, let's say, more political and moral grounds, warning that if the European Union would not get its act together and show solidarity vis-a-vis member states which have been hit by the crisis, it would not survive. And in the second category, one may think of Jacques Delors, Commission President, who warned that the microbe was back, and he meant not just the virus, but also in a way the microbe of nationalism, with his fine sense of metaphor. But one may also think of the Pope, even Pope Francis around Easter 2020, basically appealing to the European nations to remember that they are one family. So we have this sequence, February, March, April, and where the end seems nigh, so to say. And then there is a rather remarkable and surprising turnaround in that early phase of 2020, where things start to move fairly rapidly, and where, I mean, I'm going to cut the story short, obviously, but where by the summer, two almost revolutionary decisions have been taken, which give substance to this idea that this was a crisis affecting all of Europe and which needed a joint response. And these two decisions obviously are the Corona Recovery Fund, which was decided in principle at the summit of July 2020, and the other, maybe even more surprising decision, even if less revolutionary, informed the decision in June 2020 to mandate the Commission to buy the vaccine for all EU citizens. Vaccine was and still is, in a way, the end at the light of the tunnel from the pandemic, which people were waiting for, and this pandemic savior, in a way, what the European Commission was entrusted to buy it, although the institution did not have any experience with it. But it was a sign of refound unity and solidarity after a moment of immense tensions and rows, including between Northern and Southern Europe on the issue of financial solidarity. So in the book, I tell that story, focusing on public health response, a bit also on what happens in the field of borders, and then financial matters. So that's a chronicle, and well, it's part, as you said, Anthony, of an ongoing story. So what the book also aims to do, and that's the second point I'm coming to, is beyond just the chronicle of this single crisis, to put it into a perspective of an ongoing transformation the European Union is undergoing, in my view, and which we can date back at least, let's say, to the beginning of the financial and banking crisis of 2008, in the sense that a whole series of shocks and unexpected events or things going wrong have hit the European Union as such, or individual member states, and where a new kind of politics had to be even invented almost. And the terms I use, and maybe some readers are familiar with this, but I'll be brief, is to say that the European Union, which historically was built to do rules politics, to in particular with the view of building a very impressive continental market for the free movement of goods, people, persons, etc. A system built to do rules politics alongside that practice also has to develop now a capacity to do what I call events politics. That is to deal with unexpected situations. And the differences are really crucial and in a way underestimated. And the first which jumps to mind is the difference of the time perspective. In rules politics, when it is about common legislation in the field of internal market, in most cases, you can take time to negotiate between institutions, between the Council and the Parliament, but even also in a way before that, the Commission takes a lot of time consulting with stakeholders, preparing, researching before even the Commission, the proposal is put on the table. A whole process which may take years, even from initial idea to the day it finally is part of the Journal officiel de l'Union Européenne, isn't it? But that is a great quality, of course, because it means you can be careful, you can bring everybody in, consult, patience, etc. But in times of danger, that patience, that carefulness becomes a weakness, because these are situations when a country or a banking system risks going bankrupt, when you have migrants at borders, or when you have a pandemic hitting all economies or public health systems, which require speed of action and of decision. So that's a crucial difference. The second one is the experience or perception of the public, of public opinion of the type of politics. In a way, the classic market building rules politics was interesting for people making their money with it, stakeholders or maybe farmers and fishermen, but not so much for the public at large. And among political scientists, the not so beautiful term permissive consensus has been used for decades to express that idea of a, well, let's say, polite indifference vis-a-vis what was going on in Brussels. Now, in that perception, that experience of the public of EU politics has completely changed in all these crises. I think the Euro crisis was very striking, where you had masses of people demonstrating on the public squares of Athens or Madrid. Migration crisis was another upheaval, which caused deep rifts within societies and between member states as well on what the best way forward was. And I will not mention Brexit, which not only in the UK, but also across the continent has in a way deeply impressed, I think, public opinion. And the pandemic was in certain stages another such experience, but I'll come to that in the third point. Now, this overall metamorphosis from the EU specializing in rules politics and being world champion in it, to the EU also having to learn to do events, politics dealing with events, as a consequence maybe of this need for speed and to persuade the public, brings also a change of caste, of political personnel. That is to say that alongside the traditional EU actors, with the Commission being center stage, in particular for the rules politics, you see more and more also national leaders stepping in all these crises, going all the way back to Merkel and Sarkozy with the banking and Euro crisis. And also in the pandemic, there was an interesting new interplay between the European Council and the Commission, and I have no doubt we will discuss that in more detail during our exchange later on. But this change of political caste, in my view, is just a normal, or in a way, what is normal, but a not so surprising consequence of the challenges the EU is faced with. and to which the institutional system is adapting formally and informally. Now to conclude, Anthony and the audience, the third point, so not just the chronicle and the metamorphosis, but there's one thing which has really fascinated me in well, also experiencing this pandemic myself as a citizen, but also as an analyst, is the role public opinion played in this crisis, triggering EU political action, and which in my view is completely novel. And we have not seen such a thing to the same extent before. And maybe again, starting with this very, well, pretty disastrous moment of the COVID outbreak, right? When from the side of the EU, institutions, the argument which was made was, well, this is obviously horrible and we'll do what we can, but in a way there are also certain limits because public health is just not an EU competence, or we can only take some supportive action. So it was a kind of a legal, formal, defensive line to that inaction. But that answer, maybe technically correct and understandable, was just not good enough. Huh? Public opinion, starting in Italy, Spain, and elsewhere, wanted Europe to act, whoever that was. I mean, when people say they want Europe to act, I'm not saying it's very clear in their mind which institution or whether it's member state, etc. But this crisis was simply so overwhelming, and it was nobody's fault. We had these weird lockdowns, risk of mass layoffs, geopolitical divide and rule by China and the US, which was also noticed. So all of this together gave rise to this idea that Europe had to do something in whichever guise. And this is what triggered and what forced the Union to take on a shape it did not yet have. If I just, for the sake of the argument, contrast with the financial crisis and the storms in that field from 2008 onwards, in a way, these were calmed top-down, really. Governments, alarmed by central bankers and experts, had to convince reluctant parliaments, reluctant public opinions on the need for very drastic and far-reaching decisions, be it on the field of austerity, reform, or solidarity. And the public, in a way, just looked on and hadn't asked for anything. And in the pandemic, it's the other way around. It is a public call for action, for solidarity as well, which triggered political action. Now, maybe just to conclude and break it down, this third element a little bit more, you can say, obviously, well, how does this work? Huh? Because it may sound a little bit abstract, the public call for action. And it's true also that at the moment when coronavirus hit, obviously it was not an immediate moment for Europe, and nor was it for public opinions. It started with a very national moment in a way, almost a groundswell of national sentiments, where day after day, all our societies were counting the dead. We were listening to solemn speeches by kings and queens and presidents and prime ministers, listening to the news, all these very dark numbers. So in a way, intensely experienced moments of national belonging. And at the same time, and there it started becoming interesting, because the uncertainty, the political uncertainty was so great, governments did not really know what to do. It was trial and error. One member of the European Council summed it up succinctly by saying and admitting to his home audience that with 50% of knowledge, they had to take 100% of decisions. This was Prime Minister Rutte from the Netherlands. Very frank in that respect. But it also meant that people were really looking next door. They were looking at the neighbors. Well, myself, I live in Belgium, so there's a comparison with France always, with the Netherlands, Germany. We were all looking at what the neighbors were doing in terms of what approaches to vaccine and face masks, etc., were working on them. But in the EU, and here's the trick, it even went further than that. It went beyond mere comparison. And that has to do with the interdependence, obviously, of our currency, of the market, and also of our open border system, where people started to realize and communicate, well, listen, it matters what the neighbors decide. It matters which government gives the green light to which vaccine. It matters when we have a Schengen system, how public health measures with relation to the pandemic are followed up or not. And also, it matters whether, well, let's put it how it was, Germany puts billions of euros into its industries and businesses to save them, when we, let's say in Italy or Spain, do not have such deep state pockets to keep up our industry. So there was this new experience of that this was a common cause, a public affair, and also interestingly, new ways and means were found to communicate this. A striking example, but there are others, was that a number of local Italian politicians bought newspaper space or ad space in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung in Germany to convince the German public directly that they needed to give support. So I want to close with this, Anthony, because in a way it was a dramatic and disastrous situation, but the fact that in that moment, and for some of the reasons I outlined, there was also a sentiment of, to some extent, belonging, or at least experiencing as Europeans all the same dramatic event at the same time, which was translated into political action, is in a way heartening also for an institution like the European Parliament, which obviously is so crucial in also giving shape to some of these ideas and pan-European debates. So this by way of introduction, and again, I'm very much looking forward to talk on some of these matters in more detail after my colleagues have taken the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Luuk, for that, and for setting the scene so eloquently, and describing how the current crisis may contribute to the building of the new European political system. And to give her perspective on what you've written and what you've said today, I'd like to pass over to Katarzyna. Over to you.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for your kind invitation. It is a great honor to speak among so distinguished guests. And thank you also, Professor Van Middelaar, for the presentation of your thought-provoking book, because it was a really intellectual pleasure to read Pandemonium. And I think the reason that I was invited today was my review. So I will use arguments that I presented in this review and relate to the already presented ideas. And for those interested in reading the whole piece, I can attach the link to the review just in the chat. So yes. Yeah, here it comes. Sorry for that. And to start with my presentation, once again, Professor Van Middelaar has offered a compelling narrative about the EU politics. As we might have noticed during the presentation, the coronavirus pandemic, in this perspective, is not just another crisis the EU has to tackle. It is a metamorphosis. It is a passage to another phase of European integration, or to use Professor Van Middelaar's own vocabulary, It is a transition in time toward a new chosen future. This interpretation indeed sounds familiar to those acquainted with the previous works by the author, most notably also already mentioned the passage to Europe, what proves that his arguments are coherent and embedded in a broader theoretical framework. In this optics, the pandemic was a period of ground breakthroughs. Not only has the EU tied the common economic bonds more strongly, not only has the European public emerged with a strong voice, but also geopolitical situation of the EU has changed dramatically, especially vis-à-vis China and the US. But surprisingly, in the book, there is little talk about Russia, and perhaps we can then discuss it in the Q&A. What is absolutely fascinating is the fact that Professor van Middelaar deploys the language of theater when describing the event's politics. This kind of language suits perfectly well with the drama of the pandemic, when the decisions had to be taken really quickly, when the public carefully watched scenes from Italy, and where was a grand final, so the issuing of a common debt. Ultimately, this theatrical metaphor leads the author to focus predominantly on the handful of actors, while the others are assigned the episodical roles or the collective role of the Greek choir in this diplomatic ballet. In this perspective, only a few people are capable of grasping Machiavellian fortune. Few people only understood the pandemic's impact on the internal tensions within the EU. And quite interestingly, these are the politicians from the old Western European states only. And here I come to my criticism. Even though the common debt and the recovery fund undoubtedly were huge successes of the European politics and could not happen without the unanimity among the member states leaders, somehow in the author's narrative, the true heroes remain Angela Merkel, Mark Rutte, and Emmanuel Macron, and sometimes also the Commission and the Council, but the Council represented not by the member states, but its president, Charles Michel. The southern countries are mentioned in the context of their demands for solidarity and compassion, like hard-hit Spain and Italy, but there is no place for Central and Eastern European countries, apart from a short mention of the rule of law problems and their impact on receiving funds. And it seems that this kind of analytical strategy slightly undermines Professor van Middelaar's narrative of community of destiny that the EU supposedly is. Because how come the European Respublica can function without embracing all of its member states? Or to put it differently, what is the role of other national leaders in the event's politics and how to accommodate their interests in the event's politics? And then the author, it seems, excludes also Central and Eastern European countries, not only politically, but also somehow epistemically. He uses English, Dutch, German, and French sources, but rather does not refer to English sources published by journalists and experts from this region. And it is striking, especially when the author writes about Belarusian 2020 rigged elections. And I know that is not the core of the book, and it's rather a digression, but it proves something that is quite important for me and striking because of the current border crisis, when the knowledge about this region is essential. So the author claims that the massive protests in Belarus were spurred on because of the poor handling of the pandemic by Lukashenko, but it seems that it is not the case, and different sources would point to combined reasons for the protests. But here, Professor van Middelaar quotes sources like Financial Times, Le Monde, and Der Spiegel, what is quite interesting for me. Another point regards the consequences of the recovery funds. So the univocally positive reading of the common debt and the recovery fund might be also somehow challenged, because it was undoubtedly a novelty and an economic alleviation in the context of the pandemic. And in the context of the past reluctance of the frugal fourth to support the southern states. But on the other hand, the recovery fund and the mechanisms behind it might give further tools to the bigger countries to discipline the states that do not comply somehow with a concrete resilience plan. So, in other words, this emergency measure might lead to exerting even more coercion by a set of EU executive agents. And perhaps this possibility that could be read in line somehow with the federalist telos of the EU could be elaborated a bit more by the author. And my last point would regard the issue of the European public, which was already elaborated on by Professor. And I mentioned before that during the pandemic drama, the Europeans were closely following the calamity that happened in Italy in March 2020. And for Professor Vernon Bogdanor, this common horrific experience mediated through social media, together with shared rituals like singing on the balconies, we all remember that, could serve as a basis for the creation of the European public. The national leaders started to speak to the European and not only national public. And it is interesting that the argument that the European public does not use one common language, the author deems as absurd. For Professor van Middelaar, the public communicates with a universal language of emotions. And according to the author, we should embrace what is already there. So an unstructured public which applauds and understands goals and catcalls, but doesn't it create a too low threshold for democracy? Does it not resemble the Pole's democracy, which makes the political leaders dependent on quickly changing moods of the public? It is doubtful if such poll-based politics can achieve desirable outcomes or even express them. The public demands influence over how the play develops, but is not even able to articulate its demands and can only be reactionary to the emergency measures that are introduced. And it seems that this approach to the European public might not help to solve the problem of the input and output legitimacy, which is constantly a problem for the EU, as we know. And just to conclude, despite my critical words, I really enjoyed the book, and the meticulously written month-to-month account of the events politics give an enormous insight into the functioning of the emergency EU. But on the other hand, the book shows that the EU's powers is based not on the institutional framework, but rather on the individual agency of some of the national leaders, what might be not an optimistic conclusion after all. And here I will stop. Thank you very much, and looking forward to future discussion. I hand over to Anthony.
Well, thank you very much, Katarzyna, for those pithy insights, which I can see from his facial reaction have certainly aroused the interest of Luuk. And for those of you who have tuned in, we're now around 80 people online at the moment. We are talking about Luuk van Middelaar's new book, Pandemonium, Saving Europe. And we have two discussants who are giving their own particular perspective on the issues which Luuk raises. And most recently there, the concept perhaps that this is less about building a genuine political community and a community of fate or of destiny, but rather perhaps the reassertion of a certain kind of sometimes rather selective elite politics at European level. I'd now like to go over for the second commentary to Professor Vernon Bogdanor, who I think is in London at the moment. Vernon.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and particular thanks to the European Parliament for inviting an outcast, as it were, to speak. I suppose we Brits are now outcasts in the European Union, and I'm glad that relations haven't completely come to a halt. I think any comment on Luuk's book must begin with saying what a profound work it is, particularly the first third in which he discusses the evolution of European institutions. I should say profound like his other books, and I think Luuk is one of the very few who actually does understand how the European Union works, and that might be in part due to his training as a philosopher. I don't know. I have three comments to make on the book. And they really follow on from what Katarzyna was saying. But my first is that he talks about the European Union reinventing itself often, which is clearly right. And if I've understood him correctly, he's saying this particular reinvention as a result of events is broadly towards intergovernmentalism. And I think in his earlier books, that broad trend is also there. And that's a paradox in a way, because the purpose of the European Union was to resolve problems which national governments on their own could not resolve. And my question here is whether the institutions and the constitution of the European Union should not now reflect this trend. When the European Community was set up, the central institutions were thought to be, by different people, the Council of Ministers or the Commission. Are they still as central as they were? And in particular, is the right of legislative initiative, the sole right of legislative initiative that the Commission has, becoming anything more than a slightly polite fiction? Is that really the case that the Commission has that initiative, broadly speaking? My second point relates to the question of European solidarity. And if I've understood Luuk correctly, he says this establishes a new precedent for European solidarity. But could one take an alternative view and say this is an emergency? It's a one-off and perhaps temporary, that particularly the sharing of cash. How long will that solidarity last in the face of what may be seen as feckless Southerners and illiberal East Europeans? That's a question I ask. How long the richer countries will be prepared to subsidize countries which they may think are feckless, or which they may think do not conform to the liberal norms of Eastern Europe. The liberal norms of the EU. My third point relates to the democratic deficit, which I think Luuk, in common with everyone else, has not resolved. And indeed, I think that the institutional framework that he suggests with the central role for the European Council makes it more difficult, because the European Council is not only, as Katarzyna said, an elite, but it's at least one remove from democratic accountability. It's beyond the reach of the European Parliament, of national parliaments and people, because it's clearly not responsible to the European Parliament, nor can it be responsible to national parliaments, because the European Council agrees a package which cannot be untied by national parliaments, a package as a result of compromise, perhaps reached behind closed doors, but at any rate, national parliament cannot untie it, or the whole package goes. And if Luuk can resolve those three problems, he'll be even more in our debt than he is with his book. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Vernon, for those comments more in the form of questions. I'm going to pass back to Luuk now to pick up on the two sets of remarks that have been made about his book, and also to invite the 81 people who are currently online to post questions or to make comments themselves. There's plenty of opportunity to do that. You can do it either through the Q&A support function there, or by going on to the chat function. And I'll try and take as many questions as posed as possible in the 45 or so minutes that remain. But before we go to Q&A, back to Luuk.
Thank you, Anthony, and thank you to Katarzyna and Vernon for very careful reading and very stimulating comments and questions. So I will try and take them in order of appearance, to use a theatrical term, starting with Katarzyna's first point relating a drawback of the theatrical metaphor, in the sense that it, if I translate you correctly, it puts all the attention on some protagonists, some key leaders. They are, as it were, in the limelight, and others act more in the back stages, as it were. And hence, you suggest a maybe exaggerated attention for certain leaders in Brussels, Paris, and Berlin above all. Well, yeah, I can see the effect of that staging approach. And I think it is important in telling a story to bring it to life also, and to pay attention to politicians who embody certain decisions and have to really act in time. In my view, it is one of the specificities of this events politics or crisis politics, especially in these moments, where a feature is that the eminent uncertainty of the moment, where you cannot rely on precedents or on existing rules or even on sound science, as in some cases in the pandemic, and where therefore the responsibility of individual political leaders is even bigger to step forward and to take responsibility for a decision and to persuade. And if there's one political actor who I give credit in this crisis, I did not do so in all previous crises, and the way I talked about them is Chancellor Merkel, who really, for me, the crucial moment is when Merkel indeed changes tack and decides to join Macron with this Corona Recovery Fund initiative, Franco-German initiative at first, which was then embedded in the institutional. Now, your point that I neglect other actors, and in particular those from Central and Eastern Europe, I do not entirely agree, because it is, in my, well, the way this story, let's say the story, the plot of this crisis, and in particular the most important decision on the financial field, Corona Recovery Fund, in a way was a reenactment of the Eurozone crisis from 2010. So it was a north-south crisis. So, and this is why, indeed, I speak about Merkel, Macron, institutional actors, bank presidents, frugal leaders like Rutte, also other southern leaders like Conte and Costa, because that was the main story. There are indeed more side appearances or anecdotal appearances, yeah, you're correct, of certain experiences or moments of where Central and Eastern European countries or leaders played a role. I mentioned the travel bubble between the Baltic states, or the fact that Central Europe had a relatively good first wave and a not so good second wave in the autumn of 2020, and so on. But well, I mean, happy to discuss. But in my view, the key decision there, it was not that story. It was different in other stories I've told in previous books on the migration crisis, obviously, or on our relation with Russia. Point taken on the my lack of knowledge of Slavic languages, and well, it's a matter of fact, I can apologize. So yeah, I have to rely on secondary sources. Not much I can do about it, but I'll take the point with me for next time, as they say in French, entendu. Now, on your point, Katarzyna, on the interpretation of, let's say, the Hamiltonian moment, to use the most dramatized language that has been used by some, not by me in the book, by the way, on talking about the Corona Recovery Fund. I'm fully with you on the comments you make, that we have to see how this plays out. what the effect will be in terms of administrative executive power for the Commission, drawbacks. And the reason I'm in the book, I give a positive twist to this story is because it showed the capacity to act, it showed unity, it showed solidarity after, my apologies, this is something I never know how to stop, after a very, as I said before, disastrous moment. So, and that was remarkable and commendable, but I agree, the jury is still out how this will evolve. The final point, which also links to some of Vernon's comments on the issue of the public and democracy. That is a bit stimulating comment, whether how to put it, whether the fact that my claim is indeed, as you summarized, that it's not necessary to all speak the same language and to engage in a kind of Jürgen Habermas debate on arguments alone, to have a shared experience as a public. But I do not agree that when I open up the criteria, or when I lower the standards, to put it like you, that it's only about emotion. That's not true. It is also about getting to terms with the same facts, like the fact of the pandemic, like the fact of our vulnerability, geopolitical vulnerability in the wider world, our health, public health vulnerability. These were just, these were experiences which somehow asked for a response. And the public, the emergence of a feeling by many that this was a common cause is not just emotion. It is, I think, it is an experience, a reaction, a response to certain facts. And then it has to be translated, and indeed in later stages, in more subtle manners, and given form and shape in decisions and institutions. But I would not agree with the distinction rational versus emotional and opening up the floodgates. Although it is true in general that in EU discursive practices and the way that you communicate alongside, to use the classic Aristotelian triptych, alongside all the logos, the arguments, there might be a little bit more pathos and ethos, so that is emotion and personal character as well. I'm turning now to Vernon's 3 questions, but not after having thanked you once again, Katarzyna, for your very careful and in a way intellectually honest reading also of not only this book, but also putting it in the context of my other works, which I really appreciate. And that's, for an author, it's nice to see that new products are not just seen as one-off, but as part of a series. Vernon, thanks for your reading and for sharing indeed some of your pleasure while reading the book. Your first comment was, you used the term which I always avoid somehow, intergovernmentalism, as an overall trend in European politics in the past 15 years, and whether that does not call for even changes in the system to reflect that trend. To be a little bit more brief, so we also have time for questions, I don't think that requires changes in the system. In a way, the crucial question is It's maybe not intergovernmental or supranational, but the crucial question is where is the political executive in the EU? Any political order has 3 branches. We're pretty okay in the EU on the side of the judicial branch. That's the court in Luxembourg. There's no debate. We're a bit less sure about the distinction between the legislative and the executive. Well, the parliament definitely is a legislative power. It's even called a co-legislator finally now in the Lisbon Treaty. The council also is the other co-legislator, but then where does this leave us for the executive? We have the Commission, we have European Council, I would say also certain council configurations like the Eurogroup or Foreign Affairs Council, maybe even the ECB. It's all part of the executive somehow. And it is, in this crisis, there was also, I think, a very productive interaction between, in particular, the Commission and the European Council, and certain members of the European Council, indeed, to respond to this shock, where the European Council, as a crisis body, is able to not only give general orientation, but also to take the kind of decision which, in fact, either formally or informally, change the rules of the game. Be it treaty change or membership issues. I won't mention in your presence Article 50, but now I did mention it. Or informal rules, changes of rules of the game, like the Corona Recovery Fund. It's such a far-reaching decision that you could always say, and some people would argue, it changes the constitution with a small c of the EU. That is the whole set of informal and formal practices and norms because of what the EU decides to do. And that type of decision in the EU has to be taken by the European Council, but in a way it was prepared partly by the Commission machinery and followed up, and the Commission will, as Katarzyna also pointed out, get a rather important role in the oversight. So there was an interplay and not a rivalry. In this case, there have been other examples in the past between the two parts of the EU's political executive. And I think the system does not need to be changed, but because it allows to adapt and to respond to these various situations. On the question whether the Commission still has the legislative initiative in practice, and whether perhaps, as you suggested, maybe in 90% or more, the Commission acts upon the request of other institutions, including the Parliament, by the way, and the Council and the European Council. Maybe I can refer to the Director General we have in our midst, and I no doubt the EPRS has done excellent research on this to give us the precise numbers. I don't have them, but I think it is really less than 10% where the Commission really acts upon its own initiative without, let's say, input beforehand from either of the 3 other political institutions which I just mentioned. On solidarity, whether the Corona Recovery Fund, if I understood you correctly, because there was a little bit of a sound issue at that moment on my side, was a one-off or temporary. Well, even if it's temporary, it's a pretty long period we're talking about, right? Because it will run into 2058 to pay back all the common debt that will that the Commission will raise on the markets. And but that's just a technocratic answer. Politically, you're fully right that the solidarity which is presumed, as it were, and which has been given shape to in this decision, in the end, of course, relies also on the support of public opinions to continue backing it. And in that respect, I think it will be very important indeed how well the money will be spent, and whether that will be lead to visible economic progress or convergence or reform, both in Southern Europe and Italy. Everybody will be looking at Italy, and the Italians know this. This is why they made Mario Draghi Prime Minister of Italy, and directly related that nomination to the recovery fund discussions within Italy, but also to the East. I fully agree, and it's hard to predict now, but there is potential tension there. Well, maybe if you allow me to continue, not to solve the third issue of democratic legitimacy, then we will have more time for the questions, and maybe the question will come up again, and then I'll give a proper answer there, Anthony, because I realize I've been a little bit long.
No, that's been great. Thank you very much, Luuk, and thank you to the two others who've posed the very penetrating questions that you tried to respond to there. And in fact, that leads quite naturally to the first question that's come in so far, which is from Antoine Ripoll. He observes that he thinks it looks as though there are two forms of euroscepticism, those people who want more Europe and those who want less Europe than is currently on offer. But then he asks a question which I think bears upon the point that you were just about to come on to, which is how best to use the momentum in favour of greater European action, which the pandemic has generated, and to some degree also Brexit has contributed to on the continent, to anchor what he calls a more roots-based EU integration process. And it seems to me the issues of democratic legitimacy and democratic participation are obviously at the centre of that. So maybe, Luuk, you would like to pick up on that, and then we'll ask the other two panellists to give their own views on the same issue. Over to you, Luuk.
Thank you to Antoine. I haven't read, but I carefully listened to the question. So when you say that there are two types of euroscepticism, not only those who think the EU is too powerful, but also those who think it is not powerful enough, or at least not doing enough. Well, analytically, I can see the argument. Politically, I do think that the first group is much bigger, much more powerful in almost all member states, and maybe the second group, those who are disappointed by a lack of EU action, is growing, and indeed, as you say, has momentum. But it is probably a minority view in most member states. So it will be very difficult for that group to translate only that momentum, let's say, in treaty changes and those kind of discussion, without opening debates, which will also give a lot of energy and oxygen to the other side of the debate.
Thanks. Maybe Katarzyna, you'd like to come in on this very particular issue.
Yeah, maybe I will be just brief. I see that there is a tension or a small paradox, because on the one hand, we've experienced this kind of momentum, this moment of solidarity, unprecedented economic solidarity between the member states. But on the other hand, it seems that the European member states are starting to develop a more nationalistic approach. They are less willing to integrate. And it is especially striking in the case of France, with the case of Michel Barnier, who started to speak about the sovereignty referendum in France, which is really disturbing somehow. So this moment of pandemic seems very paradoxical, and perhaps we should wait some more time to determine whether it will produce more solidarity and more integration, or rather be a point of time with no deeply rooted consequences, I guess.
Thank you for that. Over to Vernon.
Well, I did want to comment on the idea of the public democracy as shared experience. It seems to me this isn't sufficient. Young people in different countries enjoying a music festival have a shared experience, but that has no political implications. Democracy is not a matter of shared experience, but of institutions and accountability, institutions securing accountability. And Luuk in his book discusses the American public at the time of the founding of America. And of course, that led to institutions being created to express that, well, I won't call it democratic accountability, but representative accountability perhaps. And the question that I asked is whether the European Council can in any way be made accountable. And furthermore, that the EU is developing into something radically different from what most of its ideologues, if you like, believed it would be. And my question then follows on, should we not face up to that and make it explicit, or is it to remain forever implicit?
So that was less an answer than it was a set of further questions. Luuk, do you want to come back on what Vernon and indeed Katarzyna?
Yeah, I think so, because indeed I was a bit quick in answering in the first round on some of the points Vernon put on the table, in particular European Council accountability. But let me start with the public as well, because for writing the book, I reread a great book by John Dewey, American philosopher from the early 20th century, The Public and Its Problems. And Dewey has a great theory in that book, which is original in the way he thinks about the origins of the state. Because the traditional, state theories put all the limelight, as Katarzyna would also say it, on strong personalities, state builders, founders, legislators, etc. And this is indeed a kind of tradition going back to Machiavelli. What Dewey does, however, is to say it is not always top down, these dynamic drivers of action and the public following. No, there are also situations where the public comes first. And the way he defines the public is that he says, once people realize that something affects them in common, it can be a natural disaster, or it can be other people acting in the sphere of the economy, which is very much the center of his interest, or politically, as in a conspiracy or something. When they realize that it affects them in common, and becomes a crucial thing, organize themselves accordingly with public officials, etc. And then Dewey says something having the traits of a state comes into existence. So he just turns it upside down. And I don't think that works every time, but in this single pandemic experience, I think there was a translation from an experience to a call for action, and a translation in public decisions and even institutions. So that's one question. The other is European Council accountability. I think, seen from the point of view of a parliamentary system, where you have a direct relationship of accountability between the legislative and the executive, as we indeed have in most European societies, it will remain messy. However, I mean, in constitutional theory and in systems out there in the world, not all political orders are parliamentary. There also is a rather famous presidential system in the United States, where there is no direct accountability between what the president does in the White House and what the legislative does on Capitol Hill with Congress. There is a permanent relation of negotiation, obviously, between the president and the Senate and Congress for almost every single piece of legislation or nomination. Think about Supreme Court nomination. But it is not that the president is accountable to the legislature. And then we have, as Vernon knows, as a professor in politics, what we call semi-presidential systems like France. Well, in my view, the EU looks most like a semi-presidential system, to put it short, where with the European Council playing the role of a collective president, which is not accountable to a single individual parliament, but to all voters in member states individually. But the EU system also has clearly traits of a parliamentary system, with the Commission indeed as a kind of government and the European accountable to the European Parliament. Just like in France, the Prime Minister is accountable to Parliament, even if the President is directly elected by government. So I'm sorry to be a bit fast here, because and this is a bit of constitutional theory, but yes, it will remain messy if you only look from the classic parliamentary perspective. If you take a little bit broader view of what other systems will work, you might make sense of the EU. I spent a page and a half on this in the Alarums and Excursions, and I can send you the page number, Vernon, because I can see you look a bit puzzled here, but I'm afraid I can't do any better synthetically like this here.
I don't know whether Vernon wants to come back on that briefly.
The implication is you'd be directly electing the European Council, which would be a bit, well, it might not be observed anyway, it doesn't happen. The analogy would be as if all the governors of the American states together formed an American executive, and then it wouldn't be accountable in the way the European Council isn't accountable. So I don't think that, honestly, there's an analogy with a directly elected president either in America or France. It's a sui generis executive, the European Council, as I say, as if the governors of the American states were all together as the executive, the federal executive. So I still think there's a huge problem here.
In Sami Feiner's book, Comparative Government, admittedly it's quite old now, but he says that, of course, the French Fifth Republic is not semi-presidential, but hyper-presidential, because the executive enjoys the benefits of what the US president has, which is direct election, and what you find in parliamentary systems, namely the authority of the executive sustained by parliamentary majority. That, of course, is assuming that the French president and the French parliament are at the same time in alignment, which has normally, but not always, been the case. This bears actually on the second question that's come in, which has come in from Etienne Bassot, who comments, as I think many of us would, that he thoroughly enjoyed reading the book. And I must say, personally, I particularly like the first 50 pages with this analysis, if you like, of the hidden assumptions of the European Union political system. And he says that one of the very interesting features of this is that under the pressure of the events, the Union has been able to be innovative and to deliver policy outcomes in a field where their prerogatives were very limited, namely health policy. So the question he asks is, do you think that's going to have a lasting effect upon the way people think about the European Union? And I'd like to add myself, if I may, a rider on that, which is that you, in your analysis, you said that one of the big questions was, where is the executive and what form does it take within the EU system? Do you feel that we are seeing the emergence of a kind of diarchy, if you like, at the top of the system, which is a combined executive of the European Commission and of the European Council, which is able to deliver both outcomes in the area of what you call rules politics and the area you call events politics, that actually has the potential foundation for quite a strong executive function going forward?
I will just start by saying yes, as a very brief answer to your question. And I'll take it up later, and I'll first go to Etienne Bassot's question on whether, if I translate it correctly, whether the experience of how the EU was able to act and to renew itself under the pressure of the pandemic will have a lasting effect on how it will be perceived. Is that correct? Anthony, is that how you? Well, I think yes. One of the points I draw attention to, it, especially in the chapters dealing with the pandemic as one in a series of crises, is the fascinating way in which older previous experiences of other crises come back sometimes to haunt us or to haunt certain politicians. And the pandemic, in a way, it was the return of the Euro crisis. And the experiences, resentments also in Southern Europe in particular of, let's say, 10 years ago, all of a sudden re-emerged. And with an image I have taken from a great German historian Reinhard Koselleck, he speaks about temporal layers. So experiences, in a way, come on top of each other in time. But just like in geology, sometimes you have a little earthquake, and then some of the older stuff lies at the surface again. And this is what happened in the Euro crisis. And in a way, if we spend just 2 minutes on the crisis at the Belarusian border, which Katarzyna alluded to, there in a way you have a re-emergence of memories of the migration crisis and the EU-Turkey deal, which, although the situation is completely different in many respects, is occupying people's minds or even blinding sometimes political judgment. So I think in the same way, it's hard to tell now, but this experience, which was rather intense, will remain with us, both some of the disappointments. I don't think the Italians will soon forget their loneliness at the start of the outbreak, the lack of solidarity coming forward, or the lack of action from Brussels. So that memory will also remain with them, and hopefully so will also the memory of more successful joint action. Now, very briefly, adding to the simple yes to Anthony's question. Yes, I think that's also how it was supposed, or how it is supposed to work. That over time, in a way, due to a process of sometimes competing visions of the European future, with one vision, as we just said, the parliamentary vision, putting the Commission as a future government. On the other hand, a French vision, or inspired ever since the days of the goal of having the European Council as a future government somehow. As a result of 40, 50 years of compromises, successive treaties, we have a dual center there, two institutions doing their part as parts of the political executive, with their, both I think with their strengths and weaknesses. A weakness of the European Council, obviously, is that it's very event-driven. There's no follow-up. It tends to be messy and chaotic. But the strength is that it can command huge public authority vis-a-vis public opinions. Commission is a little bit the other way around, to put it briefly. It's much, it's more serious. It has more thinking power, but it does not command. It cannot sway public opinion in very big decisions. So they really need to work together. And if you want a bad example, to which I alluded earlier on, for me, the migration crisis is a textbook example where the two executives both had their own views on how it should be solved. The Commission Juncker at the time pushing for obligatory asylum quota, with, by the way, one or two members of the European Council, including Merkel on that time around, interestingly, and the majority of the European Council, including European Council President Donald Tusk, being very much opposed to that and focusing on a completely different strategy. And that led to, I think, one of the worst periods in terms of institutional interplay in decades, between summer 2015 and winter 2016. Some actors drew lessons from that episode, including Jean-Claude Juncker himself, I would think. And so when both sides of the street, to talk very in Brussels, but also when both institutions realize that they need the other, that they cannot do it on their own, that the European Council needs not only the expertise, but also the institutional prerogatives of the Commission to take decisions forward, but also when the Commission realized that really the kind of constitutional changes that some crisis situations ask for, like the Euro crisis, like the pandemic, it cannot do so against the European Council. Then you get a properly functioning system. And that's also why, to come back to Vernon's first question, I don't think it is so urgent to change the basics at least of the executive on that part. I leave aside now the legitimacy issues, because it can work pretty okay if depending on indeed on the in part on the personalities and whether they get along, etc. That is maybe a weakness indeed.
Thank you for that. I'd like to actually pick up directly on that last point, which is, of course, in the past where you had intergovernmental arrangements that were gradually communitarized, you could do it in the context of successive treaty reforms. And we had, you know, some of the big loose ends of the Maastricht Treaty addressed in the Amsterdam, Nice, and the Lisbon treaties, but it now looks very unlikely that there'll ever be, well, certainly unless we face an even bigger crisis, a significant further treaty reform in the near to medium term. So is there not a risk, to come back to Vernon's point about intergovernmentalism, whatever its merits and demerits, that intergovernmental arrangements get made in crises and then get frozen as a result, rather than the elevator method, which people talked about, of moving it up to a more communitaire method in due course?
The example you have in mind maybe is the ESM Treaty, which was decided during the Euro crisis outside the formal framework, and which the Commission has tried to repatriate, to use another term, which has been doing the rounds, into the EU legal order, but so far has been unable to do so because of indeed a status quo, a desire among governments. But the other example would be precisely what happened in the crisis. I mean, all these decisions, even if the European Council played its role in blessing, basically, very far-reaching decisions, it has all been embedded from the start in the EU framework. And here the sequence is very neat between the Merkel-Macron proposal for, at the time was 500 billion euro pandemic fund. It's 18th of May, if I'm not mistaken. And then Commission President von der Leyen presenting it to the European Parliament, using its legislative initiative together with the MFF discussions. It's 10 days later. It's the 27th of May, 2020. So there was a really well orchestrated interaction between two leading members of the European Council, the European Commission President, who I haven't mentioned that obviously is a member of the European Council. So the President of the Commission, in the diarchy you mentioned, Anthony, is the crucial linchpin between these two bodies. President of one institution, member of another. So a lot therefore depends on how that person takes up the role, and also the role switching which comes with that.
I mean, if I may say so, because I want to obviously move on, but I mean, I think the counter argument to that is, or would be, that there are dangers involved in the NGEU in two precise ways. The first is that, of course, a very, very large amount of spending is being generated in one go, which is essentially reflecting national priorities and national programs. And it's been practically impossible for the central institutions to really scrutinize them to the degree that the screening should have involved. And the second is that, of course, this money that's being spent has in some way at some point to be repaid, and it's not all financed by debt. Part of it requires own resources in the future, and if those own resources are not generated and they were not provided for in the deal, then classic community spending could come under pressure. And indeed, it might well be that debt repayment in some form crowds out other traditional EU spending priorities. So there are worries and concerns on that front, but I think they're very well known here in the European Parliament, which has been one of the first to pick up on them. I'd like to ask Katarzyna and Vernon whether they have any comments on the debate that's just been going on before we move on to the next question.
I've got a brief comment. First, I think the point made by Luuk about Koselleck's work is a very profound and important one about the different sediments and historical experiences and how they surface unpredictably. And that's also true, I think, of people's personal lives, as Sigmund Freud pointed out. But I think these, I mean, 1940, I think, is that crucial point for both Britain and France, but for different reasons. making Britain a Brexit country because of Dunkirk and standing alone, and France a broadly Gaullist country. I think it's a very important point. My second point is that Anthony's diarchy point makes the democratic deficit even worse, because of course the Commission has no relationship whatever to the voters. I mean, who chose Ursula von der Leyen? Where did she come from? A German defense minister who didn't arouse, shall we say, 100% enthusiasm, then somehow translate into a key position in Europe, and that's Jean Monnet's legacy, who, as Luuk has said in a previous book, when he meant wrote of the people, he meant the elites, not the people. And so I think that makes it even worse, because the Commission isn't accountable either. And my third point is on the general point of EU health policy and COVID. And Luuk's assumption throughout is that this has been a roaring success. And I think the jury is still out on that, and whether it will be perceived as that, because I fear the truth is that the huge range of different policies adopted by different institutions and countries to deal with COVID, ranging from Israel at one end, perhaps, to Sweden at the other, and there's no real evidence that any of them, frankly, have made that much difference to the policy, that there's no obvious correlation between particular policies, shall we say early vaccination as in Israel, or herd immunity as in Sweden, or whatever, in Europe anyway, leaving America and Brazil out of it, that any country or institution has been much more successful than another. So we do rely on the fact that people will see EU health policies as a success, and it will be perceived as that. I'm not sure that's necessarily so.
Thank you for that. I'm going to go straight to the next question, which is coming from Mauro Zanzi. And he points to some of the promotional literature surrounding the book, and he quotes a particular phrase: "To become a true power among powers," Van Middelaar contends, "Europe must give firmer political shape to its own historical and cultural destiny," but then comments, "Unfortunately, the EU has refused to recognise its historical and cultural identity in the treaties," and he points, of course, to the debate that occurred over the issue of Judeo-Christian roots and identity. So is there a reluctance, as it were, to confront that particular issue head on, and does that pose a problem in terms of the potential emergence of a stronger and more confident political system? Over to you, Luuk.
Yeah, yes, thank you, Anthony, and thank you for that question to Mario, if I got the name right. I think that brings us to the end of the book, which is a short discussion, really preliminarily, of the EU's geopolitical difficult situation in between China and the US, where the pandemic has not meant a significant change as such, but it made everything much more visible. On the one hand, the emergence of China with mask diplomacy, epitomizing its new assertive and self-confident role, including in Europe. And on the other hand, the US offering a spectacle of pitiful decisions, at least under the Trump administration. So it was very unsettling for us Europeans. And what I do in that final chapter is more essay style, offering a few thoughts on if Europe means business when talking about a geopolitical commission, like the Commission President has done. It requires more than just a new tool in the overall EU toolkit. It's basically a whole change of mentality, of mindset in the way you do politics. And one example and contrast with, let's say, great powers / other great powers, be it Russia, China, or the US, is that their leaders and their political elites and even citizens very naturally see themselves as part of a very long story, civilization, notion favored in China. In US, it's also a very familiar story, which we in Europe are also very familiar with, going back to the 16th, 17th century, the founders, etc. And in Europe, and that's the main point there, we have somehow, especially within the EU, cut ourselves off anything before 1945. It was the Stunde Null, the hour zero of European integration. Everything had to radically change for very good reasons back then, but now we see that is a weakness. And I think in very general terms, as long as European actors or those who want to speak on behalf of Europe, on behalf of the European Union on the world stage, to Putin, to Xi Jinping, to a US president, and who want to credibly do so on behalf of not only Brussels or not only Berlin and Paris, but they will have to also appeal to a sense of belonging, a sense of identity somehow. Community of values, of course, is a term which is used there, but it has its drawbacks. But also even a sense of territory, a sense of, okay, we share external borders. It's also a relatively new experience in the past of the crisis decade. If you cannot do that, well, then just forget about it. Then it's just a joke doing geopolitics, right? Because with at least, well, I can be more diplomatic. Then you cannot pretend to play in the same league as some of the other actors, and then it will remain a matter of economic sanctions and a bit of this and that. But then it's not about power play. That requires a narrative of where you come from, and therefore also an idea of a shared history with all its difficulties, obviously, and its black episodes and parts of crime and shame, but that we can also assume, I would think.
Thank you for that, Luuk. I don't know whether either Katarzyna or Vernon would like to add their own thoughts on this. If so, please do. Katarzyna first.
Yeah, I can just refer here to the question that constantly Joseph Weiler puts. So whether the EU is has any mission, any telos that strives for, or rather not. So is it only a community that relies on bread and circus, or rather it has any like overarching telos that the EU is going for? So I think this tension and this problem is still not solved, as it still appears in many books. And I say so, I will leave it here.
Thank you for that, Vernon.
The EU is the only one of the world's four major powers which can't defend itself. And the question of whether you can have an EU foreign policy, a serious foreign policy, defense policy, strategic autonomy, whatever you call it, depends on the issue of losers' consent, whether those who are outvoted on any policy will accept it. And we have experience of that in Britain, because on the whole, there is that losers' consent. There wasn't in Ireland in the late 19th century. The Irish said, we're not a minority, a permanent minority in the UK. We are a majority of our own in Ireland. And the Scots may be saying that now, we don't know. I suspect in Europe, we're nowhere near that kind of situation, and there's not really that common public, that European identity that Luuk would like to see and that John Dewey talks about. I just suspect it's not really there on these very sensitive and important issues.
Thank you for that, Vernon. Thank you, Katarzyna and Luuk. Vernon's final comment actually brings us rather neatly to a little advert which I'd like to place, which is for the next European Parliamentary Research Service event. It's next Tuesday in the morning, actually, from 9:30 to 11 o'clock. That's because we have a participant joining us live from Sydney in Australia. And it's on what we're calling the Indo-Pacific Power Play, looking particularly at the role of EU-ASEAN relations in that, but more generally to the whole issue of what kind of strategy Europe can and should pursue vis-a-vis the Indo-Pacific. An issue, of course, in sharp relief as a result of some recent developments. And we'll be joined, among others, by David McAllister, the chair of the European Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee. And then the following day, on Wednesday, the 8th of December, we have the 2021 EPRS lecture, We couldn't have one last year because of coronavirus, but we're reinstituting the pattern. And Pierre Vimont, also in the same territory actually, is asking the question, is there such a thing as European diplomacy? Pierre was, of course, the French ambassador both to the European Union and to the United States, and he was the founding Secretary General of the European External Action Service a decade ago, and he'll be looking at the evolution of European diplomacy during the last 10 years. So we look forward to those two events next week. However, it falls to me finally to just thank our three speakers, and most especially, of course, Luuk for sharing his thoughts about the issues, the really profound issues which he raises in his book. And I'd like to express on behalf of everybody who's participated in this event our deep appreciation to him and indeed our two other discussants for joining us this lunchtime. And thank you also to you, those who've been online participating in this. So have a very nice and enjoyable afternoon. Goodbye.